All right, everyone, let's call this work session to order. Today is Friday, January 23rd. This is Vice Chair Brawley. I'll be running the work session today as Mr. Constant is out of town. And so first we'll do introductions. Oh, and this is, the work session is on AO 2026-10, an ordinance of the Anchorage Municipal Assembly to promote safe public spaces by amending Code Chapters 810 and 830 to expand prohibitions on unsafe and inappropriate conduct and provide criminal penalties. So that's what we're talking about today. We'll do introductions and then we'll turn it over to our presenters. And I will also note for folks watching online, there is a presentation that you can download on the website, and then members have it in their email. So first we'll start in the room. Go ahead, Mr. Johnson.
Zach Johnson. Scott Myers.
Anna Brawley. And then on the phone, we have Mr. Martinez.
Yes, thank you.
Ms. Baldwin Day.
Present, thank you.
And Mr. Gerker.
Yes, present, thank you.
Great. And any other members I missed? Okay, well, we'll keep an eye on that. And then again, folks on the phone, just text me to get in the queue. And we also have members of the administration who will introduce themselves shortly, and also in the back, members of the public, Assembly Council, and Clerk's Office. So with that, let's move on, and I will turn it over to Chief Case, or maybe Ms. Gardner, whoever would like to start.
Thank you, Municipal Attorney Eva Gardner, and up here we've got Chief Case from APD and Dennis Wheeler, Municipal Prosecutor. So I'll be available to answer questions if you have them. So this ordinance, AO 2026-10, is designed to promote safety in public spaces by closing some gaps that we noticed in our Title VIII Penal Code and refine some of the tools that existed in there to better match the situations that law enforcement officers actually see on the ground. So if we can go to the first slide. So it touches two sections of code. The first one is AMC 810-080, which is the section on indecent exposure. And what this does is add a new section that makes it a misdemeanor crime to expose your genitals in a public place. You might think this is already illegal, but the way that the law is currently drafted, you need a victim. To enforce this, you essentially need a victim available to testify as a witness in a proceeding in order to pursue and really succeed on charges if they need to be brought. And that in practice is a little bit difficult because often people don't want to stick around when somebody is exposing themselves at them. And we have seen this issue come up a few times where, the victim gets away from there and somebody else sees it, but the code requires the witness to have been offended. That's how the courts tend to interpret it. And so if you have, let's say a witness who was not personally offended by it, then they aren't really going to be helpful in promoting prosecution of these charges. So this one broadens it to just acknowledge that it is actually inappropriate to expose yourself in a public place where other people can see you. And there are some exceptions for adult establishments to ensure that those are still able to operate legally. Next slide. And the next section of code that it touches is the section on disorderly conduct in AMC 830-120. And disorderly conduct is this is in the section of code on crimes against public order. And this is what I think of as the grab bag of things that you shouldn't be doing in public that don't quite fit anywhere else. And we're modifying a few sections in here, fine tuning and expanding the section on sexual conduct in public, adding a prohibition on threatening or menacing behavior, and modifying the section on spitting or transferring bodily substances onto another person, and we're adding a new section on public intoxication. Next slide. So I'll go through each one of these one by one. So sexual conduct in public, a little bit inexplicably, code currently prohibits only consensual sexual penetration in public. It doesn't prohibit any other kind of sexual conduct in public. And it also doesn't explicitly, the inclusion of the word consensual actually poses some difficulties to prosecution if you have a kind of a questionable interaction where you're not quite sure if it's consensual or not, or maybe you think you're pretty sure it's not, but it's not quite high enough, like the proof isn't quite there for the state to prosecute as a felony rape. Then we are in this weird position where do we have to bring charges that it was consensual, which is very offensive to the victim, perhaps in that case. So removing the word consensual and then adding a new section that broadens this prohibition to include a much wider range of sexual conduct. And to get the description of that additional sexual conduct, we looked at the other section of code on exhibitions harmful to minors and pulled a few of the provisions out of there. You can see them on the slide. And the idea here is that if you shouldn't be doing it in front of children, you really shouldn't be doing it in a public place, because all kinds of people come in public places, including children. So that is that section in the, yeah. Okay, moving on though, next slide. The next part that we changed is adding a prohibition on threatening or menacing behavior that interferes with other people's ability to use a public space. And right now, in terms of what kind of general just behavior we prohibit in public spaces, it's really just loud noises when it comes to how you're conducting yourself. And that seemed inadequate, because there are a lot of things that you can do beyond loud, other than loud noises, that really drive people away from public spaces and make it unsafe for them to be there. So this adds threatening or menacing conduct that interferes with others. Next slide. Next is spitting or transferring bodily substances. Also, a little bit inexplicably, this section is a pre-existing section, but it made it a misdemeanor to spit or transfer bodily fluids onto a public servant. We are broadening that to be on to any individual without their consent. And there is another section of code, harassment, that makes it a crime to spit or transfer bodily substances onto another person. But that one is a higher level of misdemeanor. It's an A misdemeanor, and there's a higher standard for the mental state. You have to have reckless disregard for the offensive effect. And so that is one that is, again, a higher level of misdemeanor, higher penalties, and a higher standard. And this one was kind of a cleanup change to make sure that we can charge things as a lower misdemeanor, not limited to broadening the protections from just public servants to anyone. Next slide. And then public intoxication is another. These are two new sections in disorderly conduct. Currently, municipal code prohibits consuming alcohol and marijuana in public places, and those prohibitions are in 8.35, 300, and 400. But it's very hard to enforce that, because consumption is pretty fleeting. It can easily be disguised. And really the goal of prohibiting consumption in public places is to avoid having intoxicated people in those public places. So this tries to fix that problem by creating a new section on just public, I think of it as public intoxication plus, where it's not just intoxicated in public, but intoxicated in public in a high priority area, like a public sidewalk, school property, or a park, plus either you're interfering with other people's ability to use the space, or you've been offered a ride to somewhere else, maybe a shelter, maybe a safety center, and you refuse it and you insist on being intoxicated in that public space, then you could be, the laws could be enforced against you. Next slide. And just a couple notes on what these are. These are all Class B misdemeanors. They're not A's. This is the lower level of misdemeanor, and the maximum sentence for these is up to 90 days in jail or up to a $2,000 fine. And actual sentences are always at the discretion of the judge based on the particular circumstances of the case and what they think is appropriate. So I don't know that you would necessarily be seeing $90,000 and $2,000, 90 days and $2,000 on every crime. Hand it over to the chief.
Next slide, please. I think it's important to point out a couple of things before I get started. The intent of these code changes in a lot of things that we're moving forward with. Number one is these act as a general deterrent, and that is, this is all unwanted behavior or conduct, and we would love for people just not to engage in it. And then also as a specific deterrent for some of these specific acts. And if there's not compliance, then it allows us to engage with people that are involved in these types of activities. And we will continue with this code as kind of broadly what we've been doing across the board. And that is try to address the underlying issue is always going to be the primary intent. And when all of that fails, then now we have a code provision that we can use. I'm going to go through my slides pretty quickly because I wrote them in such that you can take them away and pretty much get the point. I'll go over some numbers here in just a second, but essentially, APD officers respond to a tremendous amount of calls that have to do with intoxication or disturbances, and those fit kind of in these categories. And most of those calls the officers leave without doing anything official. They don't write a police report. They're not making an arrest. Frequently, they convince people to move someplace else. Sometimes that can be just down the street, and then the problem starts up down the street all over again. And that is by far the largest volume of calls that we handle. So this allows us to have impact on some of those. I don't want anyone to get the idea that we are now going to be taking official law enforcement action on all of them. It still is going to have to fit within these codes, but it's certainly going to give us more options and close up some of those loopholes that we have. Next slide. Public spaces is clearly the area that we've been focusing on for about the last 18 months, everything from abatements to camping ordinance, as well as to these proposed ordinances. It is by far the number one complaint that I think everybody in this room gets, as well as the police department, that when we're in these public spaces, where we want to enjoy parks, trails, schools, and there's some of this conduct takes place. We've kind of maxed out the legal ability for our officers to enforce laws. And so this is addressing that a very public and very well-known challenge that we have. Next slide, please. And I already mentioned this at the beginning. We do have a multi-pronged approach. It is always compliance. It is always connection to services. And then it's taking arrest action. Next slide, please. So I bring in camping just as kind of an example. The slide that's up there is kind of since the beginning. We have seen the calls for service that come in from the camping ordinance. So in August, it was 121 calls for service. September, 131 calls for service. October, 185 calls for service. November, it went down to 53. And December, it went down to 21. The point that I'm trying to make there is that as we have used one additional tool, as well, combined with all the outreach that we're doing, the increasing shelter capacity, all of these things have combined where we have had fewer calls for service on camping during the course of the short time we've had this ordinance. We expect very similar results with this ordinance, that we're going to see a decline in activity, a decline in this type of behavior as we move forward with introducing and implementing these ordinances. We're going to have the same way that we implement this. We're going to use the first month to 2 months to start that education process, start the outreach process, and then we will start enforcing the law. And just to give a little bit of perspective, next slide, please. This is an 18-month snapshot of just straight alcohol related calls. So if you look at the second line, cleared or giving warnings, 5,474 calls, or 44% of the time. That means that an officer showing up to an alcohol related problem and somehow just moving that problem along because there's no other tool for them to use. And that's frustrating for the person that called. That's frustrating for the business that this is occurring in front of, the homeowner or residential area this is occurring in front of, and this is also very frustrating for the officers. On a similar note, our calls for service that we handled just in December alone was just over 10,000. Nearly 1,500 of those calls for service were disturbances, which, as I mentioned earlier, these ordinances are going to impact intoxication calls as well as disturbance calls. And just for your information, our second top call that we handle monthly is traffic stops. So I think that's an interesting note to point out that disturbances are our top at nearly 1,500 and traffic stops at about 850. So that's a lot of calls each month that we're handling between disturbances and alcohol related calls that this ordinance can have an impact on. And again, I want to reiterate what I've already mentioned, and that is this does not mean that we are going to be taking action on 15,000 plus calls. But some of these calls are now going to qualify for police action. Some of these calls are now going to qualify that it's going to, just like the camping ordinance, it allows us to put just a little bit more pressure on the person that we're having contact with, that they may now receive services or accept services where they wouldn't previously have done so.
Yeah, we have a question from Mr. Johnson, but also we were joined by Ms. Silvers at 9:10. Thanks. Go ahead.
Thanks. So just quickly on the slide, again, what was the time frame for this, the 12,400 intoxication calls?
That's an 18-month time frame from April 1st, 2024 to December 31st, 2025.
And then you also mentioned 1,500 disturbance calls. Did you say that was in a month?
Our calls for service in December was 10,236, and the disturbance calls of that 10,236 was 1,472.
So 1 month, that's very busy, which I'm sure is not atypical, but those numbers are significant.
Yes.
And just one more comment. The goal of this, right, the primary goal of criminal law is to deter conduct that's not appropriate and that's not safe. And so that is the primary goal of this. It's part of an ongoing effort to reset expectations, reset standards of behavior in public spaces. So,
Okay, thank you. Questions from members? I don't see any on the phone right now, any in person. Okay, Mr. Johnson.
Yeah, thank you. Question, Ms. Gardner. As I understand it, when it comes to the public intoxication pieces, there's also some state law that puts some boundaries on when you can and can't charge somebody for being intoxicated in public. Is that right?
yeah, there is a state law. There was a state act passed in, I believe, the 1970s that does say you shouldn't criminalize the status of intoxication. And I think there is a legal question. I think it's our view that it actually doesn't apply to municipalities because of some legislative history and some stuff that we have dug into. But to be safe, we don't think that this provision implicates that because it has additional factors. Like I said, it's public intoxication plus. It's public intoxication in specific high priority areas like school property. And there's another element as well in all of it. So we're not aiming to criminalize status. We are aiming to criminalize behavior.
Thank you.
Okay, I have a couple questions. I'll put myself in the queue and then others can jump in. First one is, can you unpack kind of the implications of the word knowingly? And I'll give a couple examples. So I understand, we can think of a clear-cut case where this is an issue. But two things that come to mind are, I'm going to call back to, I think it was the 2000s, the wardrobe malfunction that happened on television. Obviously not a local issue that we'd be charging, but something where someone didn't, that was an accident. Or I'm thinking of someone who has dementia and is out, in the street and clearly not all there, I guess, but may, drop their pants or something, right, where there's inappropriate behavior, but there's a different maybe mental standard. So we're just wanting to understand what knowingly means, especially because we might be talking about someone who is under the influence of something. So kind of what are the edges of that, or when would this be applied? Or in the case of someone with dementia, for example, how does that play into this kind of situation? And also we were joined by Ms. Baldwin Day in person.
Thank you for the question. This is Dennis Wheeler, Municipal Prosecutor. With respect to the issue of knowingly, and in your examples, one of the reasons prosecutors have discretion is to account for these kinds of scenarios, right? So someone who has a mental health issue, whether it's something like you're describing with dementia or some other kind of mental incapacity, there are a number of avenues we can take, one of which is to simply decline to take the case because we can't prove knowingly. Alternatively, in certain circumstances, this may be somebody who would be a good candidate for one of our therapeutic courts that deal with people with mental health issues. Or third, the court could establish and require a competency hearing to determine whether or not they actually can operate in a knowing fashion. So we have a number of steps or processes we go through. And frankly, in the scenario that you describe, I imagine the police officers will have much better luck just simply helping that person move along and wouldn't actually refer that to us for charges in the first place.
Thanks, and I appreciate that the code is just one piece of this. Another kind of general question, thinking about the public intoxication and, because I know we can imagine different scenarios where that plays out. One of them that comes to mind though is bar break. I mean, is this something where, we're talking about it in terms of public spaces, but certainly we've seen a lot of intoxicated people on sidewalks downtown, right, at about 2 or 3 a.m. So is this something where, and not because someone walks outside, right, and is getting a cab that they would be charged, but, do you anticipate or have you thought about where that fits in?
There's an application in bar break. Again, the goal is to get people safely where they need to be without causing disturbances or committing crimes or in also being a vulnerable victim to. That's a piece of this as well. So generally, the vast majority of our patrons at bar break, if they are leaving an establishment and technically they're intoxicated, they're getting to a cab, an Uber, they're getting where they need to be. That all isn't going to be impacted by this code. We do have patrons that this code potentially could be useful for. We have large disturbances that take place sometimes outside of a bar when they're not going to where they need to be and not taking care of themselves, and it triggers things that fall into disorderly conduct behavior that we'd be able to use these types of ordinances for.
Okay, other questions? Ms. Baldwin-Day.
I'm curious along those lines, the public intoxication piece. I think I know the answer, but I just want to be sure. What will the next step be if someone is publicly intoxicated and is in a public space? What is the plan for transporting them elsewhere, and how does that factor into this equation?
Member Baldwin Day, you always ask me questions that I tell you they're going to be multi-layered for you, so I appreciate the complexity. So I want to back up just a little bit to kind of so that we understand the landscape of the state statute, because I just want to make sure we're talking about all the same thing. So let's put this aside for a second. When we have somebody that is intoxicated, we have Title 47 that has some rules that talks about how we care for them. And so just generally, even when there's not a crime being committed, but they are incapacitated or intoxicated, we have a state obligation by code to try to get them home if that's a safe place for them to go. And then also a series of cascading places that we take them after that if that's not an option. And so we transport them, officers transport them to home, or they transport them to safety patrol or the hospital, depending on what the circumstances. Depending on the time of day, we also have safety patrol that can respond and also transport folks. So that still exists and is still available for people. What this code is really trying to help with is when you have folks that it's not just they're unable to care for themselves, but their conduct is impacting other people in certain specific locations. And then they refuse to cooperate when you want to try to give them a ride someplace, or you want to try to get them to safety patrol or have safety patrol pick them up, or to provide them a service that we have access to, like treatment or detox. So that's the layer that we're really trying to add on with this that is really helpful to the police department in the grand scheme of diversion.
Thank you. That's helpful. I'm curious too, with the sort of shifting gears back to the public exposure, how does this relate to folks who are urinating or defecating in public? Is that also looped into this piece of code change?
Thanks for the question. So criminal law is pretty technical, and if we were going to move forward from the prosecution perspective with an exposure, then we have to be able to prove an exposure. And so looking at this, understanding that not everybody has a home they can go to use the bathroom, looking at this, everyone has the ability to be discreet. And so if there's no exposure of the genitals, right, if they are shielded from view, if somebody is, out for a run and uses the woods, as many people do, then that's not something that would be covered. So this is not intended to be a public urination or public defecation code change.
But theoretically, if exposure did happen and someone called, then this code would potentially apply?
Yes, if somebody goes in front of City Hall and decides to urinate on the bus stop there in full view of the public, then yes, we would want this to be applied.
So there is some discretion.
Well, I think I don't know that I would call that necessarily discretion. I think that would be a very clear exposure if they are doing this in full view of the public, right? If they're exposing themselves in a public place, like, yes. So I think in that circumstance, whereas if somebody is out in the woods at Kincaid and really needs to go, that's a little different. but also technically, arguably would not meet the the requirement of exposure.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Mr. Myers? Sorry. Okay. Oh, go ahead, Mr. Wheeler.
Thank you. Through the chair to assembly members. One thing to also keep in mind is that even if we go through this process of the officer using their discretion, bringing resources to it, that person not responding in the appropriate way, then they get themselves arrested, then they go to jail, then it comes to us and we use our discretion, go through all of that. Ultimately, our analysis is, what does the community think of this? How do I prove beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury of 6 people that this person committed the crime? Do I really want to take the Woods case, and just will turn an example, to court and tell 6 people to convict for somebody for using the bathroom in the woods because nothing else was available? I don't see that happening. So there are layers of things to consider as you try to move one of these cases forward. Ultimately, the last one being whether or not I would want to take a case to 6 people and say, what do you think?
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to put myself back in the queue. I have a couple more questions. And again, folks on the phone, speak up if I'm missing your text. I'm curious on the transport piece, and you mentioned state law. I mean, it sounds like that would then turn basically, if someone is, let's say they're maybe not meeting the fullest standard where they're, threatening suicide right at that moment, but they're certainly intoxicated, they're refusing to leave. How does that interact with the Title 47 holds, or kind of, is this making basically more involuntary holds, or to the extent that you're taking somebody maybe and they refuse to go somewhere, and so then they are, then this statute apply, or this ordinance applies? How does that work?
One distinction, incapacitation and intoxication, clear distinction between the two. Incapacitation by state law, we can take somebody against their will. Like, it's not voluntary. We have that code provision. Intoxication, a little bit different. Intoxication, like currently the layer that we've added to the municipality is Anchorage Service Patrol. They will take intoxicated now, which they didn't in years past. And that's the officer communicating with this person that we want to make sure you're going to be safe. We want to make sure it's too cold. Let's transport you to this location so that we make sure that you can be safe. And then also added a layer that when they do get to ASP now, there's services being provided today versus then. So there's a little bit of a distinction here on between Title 47, the step down from Title 47, which is intoxication over incapacitation, and then the enforcement of this code.
Okay, I appreciate that. I'll also note, I was just thinking, maybe for the first time in a long time, we have no attorneys on this body. And so this is helpful to understand the legal nuance of these things. My one other question is, again, so I'm going to indecent exposure. I'm just trying to think about the edges of that. And again, the difference between I would say good faith enforcement and then, heavy leaning enforcement, which I know you have said is not the policy of this department at this time. But thinking of really, I guess the First Amendment personal expression in terms of indecent exposure, where let's say someone is out conducting peaceful protest and then they take their shirts off, right? We saw that during the Women's Live movement in the 70s, right? It was using body as a form of expression, political expression, or similarly if just thinking of, burlesque performance or these other things, you mentioned the adult spaces, but there are also, and I don't believe that they, take everything off, but someone could say that is indecent exposure to their level of sensibility. So thinking about kind of how to square those things and just making sure that we're not writing the code to be so broad that it might create risk in those areas.
Yeah, thanks. Interesting question. So this is specifically drafted to apply to genitals, which is a very specific section of the body. And I don't think that exposing your genitals in public is protected by the First Amendment. My recollection is that the First Amendment does not protect obscenity. But also this, I'm not worried about it. From a legal perspective, the lawyers are not concerned. But that is one of the reasons we included the carve out for adult establishments.
Okay, yeah, I think there's, I bring it up partly because we know there's a long history of, the kind of moral dimension, right? And then there's different interpretations of what that looks like or what indecent might be, right? So just, again, so that's a good point that the genitals is a specific one. Okay, any other questions, Mr. Johnson?
Yeah, question to Chief Case. Any sense of what this will mean, big picture, to the workload of our APD officers? Like, we know you guys are extremely busy. You gave us some numbers that I think really drive that point home. And looking at this, on the one hand, when you create new sections of criminal code, if this is approved, like, then there's the possibility that they may be making arrests and writing reports in cases where they're not currently. But on the other side of that, you also point out that they're spending a lot of time responding to incidents like this with limited tools, which I'm sure can eat up time and cause frustration when you don't really have a good solution to the problem. So do you have a sense of, how this will ultimately come out in terms of what it will mean for the workload of the individual officers taking these actions?
Yeah, good question. I'm going to say it's probably going to be a wash or a little bit more work. And the reason, and you kind of outlined it, you queued me up pretty well already. A lot of these calls that we go to, there is high volume, and sometimes we don't have a tool to solve them. It takes a little bit of time to solve the problem. A bar break question, for example, when you have somebody that's acting out at bar break and the buddies are there, sometimes you got to even turn to the buddies and go, hey, eventually this is going to turn into criminal behavior. Could you get your friend out of here? And that takes time to work through that process to get people that are intoxicated to all become rational and help each other out. A shortcut is from minute one when they come out and go, this is criminal and now covered. Like, crime's happening now. Like, let's get you guys moving in a cab. So this can speed up the process in some cases. If we're going to make an arrest, that is going to extend the process a little bit. But I don't think that the arrests are going to be so high in numbers that we are, creating volumes of work. But also, since you asked this question, I will also plug that we are doing excellent things with recruiting, and our numbers are coming up drastically.
Which is great news. Thank you.
Question from Ms. Silvers, then Ms. Baldwin-Day.
Yeah, can you tell me what transparency is going to look like? Will you have like a dashboard like you do with the camping and the fire ordinances, or how will transparency look?
We will not have a dashboard on this. Primary reason for not having a dashboard is switching over to our new computer-aided dispatch and records management system, creating new dashboards for several months. I don't know how many is kind of going to stop as we do the data migration and using new technology. So I can't promise that like I did the last one. My people would get really upset with me. The way we were intending on reporting out some of this data is probably public health and safety periodically, so that we can, just kind of like I did here today, talking about the camping numbers, so we can put stuff in perspective after we have a couple months of data, and then continuously providing that information. I'm not saying we won't have a dashboard eventually, but certainly it's going to be a while before we'd be able to update that really regularly. It'll be labor intensive.
We will have data though.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Ms. Baldwin-Day and then Mr. Gerger.
Yeah, just curious if we're anticipating any financial impacts as a result of this particular ordinance. If this in some ways creates additional needs for, folks to be moved from, point A to B or something like that, will we see any financial outlay?
I don't anticipate any financial impact, and there's a lot of reasons why I say that. Arrests, the cost to the municipality pays for misdemeanor offenses to be housed at the Anchorage jail. That's a contract we signed. That's a long-term contract, so that's not going to be impacted by this. We also have things that we put in place in the diversion arena that is already being funded during that process. So if we're diverting more people, that's not going to increase that cost. That's already been kind of set up through grants and partnerships with nonprofits and other businesses. So we already have kind of the system in place to deal with the increase, whether it's either arrests or providing services. So we don't think it's going to be an impact.
Mr. Gerger.
Yeah, thank you. Really just want to start and say thank you to the administration. I think this is good stuff. One of the things, and Eva, when you and I talked earlier this week that I shared, one of the things that people have pushed back with me about this ordinance is that, well, a lot of this is already illegal. From our conversation, that is true. However, this really gives you guys the ability to prosecute more effectively. Would you agree with that characterization?
Yes and no. I would say the kind of core conduct that we're trying to address here are things that are largely exist in other parts of code or in the existing code, but enforcement is difficult because criminal law is very technical. And so the changes we're making will mean the difference between an officer showing up and telling somebody, hey, you should really move along. And they say, or what? And the officer's like, well, I can't really do anything about it. Versus an officer showing up saying, hey, you can't do that here. And they say, or what? And they say, or you could be charged. And then that gets a higher rate of compliance. So because criminal law is technical, we have the goal here is to tailor the laws we have on the books to actually match the situations that officers are encountering. Because right now there's a mismatch and things are slipping through the cracks and they're not able to meaningfully enforce the laws that we do have. But I agree that this is conduct that everybody who is, a lot of people who engage with this think is already illegal because it is conduct that should be illegal.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, good. Okay, yeah, any other questions from members? Mr. Johnson?
Thank you. So going to page 3 here and looking at some of the DC section, generate loud noise or engage in threatening or menacing conduct. Can you give us some examples of what you think would fit that definition legally?
Yes, and I'll say in talking to people about this ordinance, I have acquired many more examples. Most people have a story, but one that seems to resonate with a lot of people is you're walking by the park, you want to go, let's say, use the playground, and there is somebody near the playground with a baseball bat acting erratically, right? Seems to not erratically, unpredictably threatening, menacing conduct. It makes you not leave the area, but it's not an individualized assault that right now we could do something with, because an assault needs to be, a threat to you personally. And so this is just generalized conduct that drives people out of a space that is really not safe or inappropriate, because chances are if you go very close to that person, you will get hurt. So that's an example of threatening or menacing conduct. And we do have the requirement, right, that you're doing it in a manner that would unreasonably interfere with others' lawful use and enjoyment of such public space. And that language is intended to make sure that, well, just because somebody is doing something that you're extra sensitive and you're kind of offended by it, that wouldn't be covered. But if somebody's doing something that is objectively, unreasonably interfering with ability to use the space, that would be covered.
Thank you. I appreciate that answer. And I think, all of us have seen it. I mean, you walk around town and you'll see folks crossing the street to go as far around somebody as they possibly can because they clearly feel uncomfortable being close to somebody who's engaging behavior like that. So it's we see it every day, and I'm glad you guys are addressing it.
Okay, any other questions? Ms. Baldwin.
I have a question about the loud noise or the disturbance piece of that. So does this include like the guy at the park with the Bose speaker that's blasting his music at full volume? Or, I mean, that's irritating. Does that track over into like this person is impeding the public enjoyment of the space? I mean,
I'll say under current code, that's already disorderly conduct. If it's at full volume and people can't carry on a conversation, that's already something that is prohibited under the existing code.
Okay, let me check one more time. I think we have gotten through our questions. So if you would like to say anything to wrap up, go ahead.
Yeah, so if we're done with the ordinance, I do want to just give an update on some public safety efforts we've been working on with the state. So we are talking with the state and cooperating with the state on 4 focus areas relating to public safety in Anchorage. And just to remind everyone, public safety in Anchorage isn't just the municipality's job, it's also the state's job. We prosecute misdemeanors, but the state prosecutes felonies, and those are the violent crimes, anything with a sentence of over a year, any crime with a sentence of more than a year. And the state, controls the airport where a lot of drugs come in. So public safety in Anchorage really does need to be a joint local state effort. So in recognition of that, we are working with them on 4 focus areas: retail theft, quality of life crimes like public space safety crimes, drug crime enforcement, and developing a strategy for a better coordination on that, and domestic violence and sex crimes. And so I just wanted to give the Assembly an update on that. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them either now or separately later.
Mr. Johnson.
Yes, what does that mean functionally? I mean, does it mean more resources for prosecutors? Is it more engagement between your office and district attorneys to make sure cases go to the right place? Kind of, how is this going to functionally make a difference?
So as one example, and we're not doing this with every focus area, but on retail theft, this is something that the state holds the keys to felony prosecutions on retail theft. And there is the ability, if you have 3 misdemeanor retail thefts within a certain period of time, you can aggregate them into a felony. And that just is more leverage, right, and higher deterrence for that conduct. And we had approached the state in the past about getting them interested in prosecuting, aggregating misdemeanors into felonies, because we do see a lot of these repeat offenses. And at the time, they did not have the staffing to do it, but we are actually very excited now that they are taking an aggressive approach to retail theft. And we have, in that focus area, have 2 municipal prosecutors who are going to be cross-designated to enforce felony law, and working with 2 state prosecutors to form like a retail theft prosecution unit that is going after these crimes. So that's one example. But a lot of it is really just making sure that we have shared priorities in these areas of making Anchorage safer, and good lines of communication, so that we can have better coordination. For example, on law enforcement, we've been discussing some better coordination on drug crime enforcement. So better communication and more feedback, where if we're seeing things slip through the cracks, then we can catch that. So a lot of it is communication, but partnership as well on those areas.
Thank you.
Ms. Baldwin Day.
I just want to be sure I heard you correctly. So there's 2 prosecutors at the state, 2 at the muni, that are sort of doing this sort of collaborative retail theft unit.
Yes. Yes. And
Okay, any other questions? Oh, go ahead, Ms. Silvers.
Can you tell me more what that partnership looks like for domestic violence and sexual assault?
yes, and I will say we're still figuring it all out, but what we've discussed so far is making sure that cases that that should be prosecuted get prosecuted. Because right now, with the municipality in charge of misdemeanor crimes and the state in charge of felony crimes, sometimes things slip through the cracks or end up, at our office when maybe they should be felonies, or it's a felony that gets, isn't a great felony, but would be a good misdemeanor. It slips through the cracks. So just making sure that we have better cooperation there. And we are reestablishing the DV unit in prosecution, as I think I've mentioned. Mr. Wheeler could speak more to that. So really trying to up the effort on that front as well, and get back to specializing in that area.
Okay. Okay, Ms. Baldwin Day, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I'd like to come back to the menacing and threatening behavior for just a moment, if you don't mind. Chief Case, I think I'm particularly interested in hearing from you. If I'm picturing myself, right, as a young mom taking my kids to the park. This is not a theoretical example. There's someone there who is behaving in a really threatening way. And instead of staying at the park, we just turn around and get back in the car. Do you have sort of, do you have a picture of how you think folks, calling the police, saying there's someone in this park that's behaving erratically, and then, do you anticipate that person or those people would need to wait then for police to eventually arrive in order for that interaction to result in some kind of action by APD? I guess I'm struggling with reporting versus response versus engagement, and how that looks when people aren't likely to stick around when they feel unsafe in a space?
Couple different ways we deal with that. If the person is gone, we obviously are going to make contact, phone, generally contact with them to try to get a little bit more information that came up through dispatch. And then when the officer arrives on scene, the officer is going to make his or her own observations. And so contact with the individual, even if they weren't there, as well as observation by the officers, could meet the requirements of the statute to make an arrest. There also may be cases where the conduct the officer sees or the person's not there on both sides, or the information the officer gets from the person. Like, we have a lot of no contact callers, so they'll report it. They don't want to be contacted. They'll leave the area. Officers get there, and maybe they'll even see the gentleman. In this case, it's a gentleman, I assume from your story. Maybe I'm assuming too much. The person with the baseball bat, and maybe his conduct is completely normal. That would be a difficult case for the officer to then now make an arrest on that behavior with a no contact complainant and just some comments and a call. So the officer's got to go through the full investigative process, show up on scene, see what they have, contact the person. But it could be an arrestable offense even if the caller leaves, but is still available for contact.
And in the event that the person that is carrying the baseball bat, I'm aware of one gentleman who has been, I think, chronically unhoused in Anchorage for a very long time, who does just carry around a baseball bat and wears a helmet and sometimes has a backpack, and in the event does struggle with some behavioral health issues. Is that person, by virtue of the fact that he is carrying a bat, maybe in a public place, maybe near a park or something, does that rise to the threshold of threatening or menacing behavior because he is carrying something that could be used as a weapon? Or does there need to be some demonstrated intent? I guess it feels squishy.
I can answer that one. So if you look at the code changes proposed, it does limit it to, threatening or menacing conduct in a manner that would unreasonably interfere with others' use and enjoyment of the space. And I think that if somebody is walking around calmly with a baseball bat, it would be very hard to prove that unreasonably interfered with other people's ability to use the space. If you are engaging in threatening behavior with the baseball bat, that's different. But I don't think that's a case that we would take. And I don't know what APD would do with that, but I imagine that's not something they'd be excited to charge on.
Sure. I think I'm thinking less about the back end and more about the front end of, who is going to, everyone has a different meter, right, in terms of their own threat assessment. And so what might be very non-threatening to me might feel very threatening to someone else. And so I'm thinking a little bit about call volume as well. And, what the less definitive, I think some of the language that's being removed is sort of puts a finer point on what threatening and menacing means. I think I'm just wrestling with what that looks like in application, and who, when people are deciding for themselves what threatening and menacing contact really means, I think that could be a much larger breadth of things than what is actually chargeable or prosecutable. And I'm thinking about how the public perceives a lack of response on the part of our law enforcement officers when they feel threatened, and that perceived threat is not necessarily responded to in the manner in which they would like for it to be. So I think there's a tension there that I'm just trying to reconcile. And I guess you don't necessarily need to respond to that unless you have, a substantive addition. But I think that's what I'm trying to tug on, is how does this impact the public's perception of call volume and their ability to feel safe and the response from law enforcement. Does that make sense? Those are like all the, sorry, it's early. I haven't finished my first cup of coffee, less articulate than usual.
So dispatch is, I'll provide a little bit of context for you. So dispatch is going to be obviously the first layer. So I always encourage call dispatch. One of the things they do a great job, anyone in here who's called dispatch, they ask a lot of questions, sometimes can be frustrating. One of the reasons is they're trying to get to that. Somebody feels threatened or afraid or, enough to have them call 911 or 311, and dispatcher is going to ask specifically, like, describe the behavior, like, why do you feel that way and what are you seeing? And generally what happens if it doesn't meet that, it's kind of at that criminal level or there's some sort of even danger to the person. So maybe what you're observing to dispatch or articulating to dispatch doesn't mean a criminal, but it does the behavior or conduct of the other person may be challenging. Like there may be an issue there that we have to respond to. Like they may be in danger. And if it doesn't meet those two thresholds, generally dispatch is not gonna send an officer and will tell the person because it doesn't meet that threshold. Now I can tell you over the last 18 to 24 months, we have tried to widen that gap a little bit so that dispatch is going to be having officers call to a little bit wider range of calls because municipal wide to include dispatchers, we understand that we do have some options for folks that might not make the criminal level, or they may not be that kind of traditional, they're a danger to themselves, but something may not be quite right. So let's send somebody out there. Let's send the appropriate team. Maybe it's mobile intervention team. Maybe it's HOPE team. Maybe it's mobile crisis team. Maybe it's a ASP. So we can have some sort of interaction and intervention with that person to provide some level of care. I will agree with you that we have to do a good job. And I think we're all responsible for this in some way or another, that there is a little bit of an impression. We see it in the police department. We see it in this room where we look at a behavior and we go, that level makes me fearful. There's probably a crime being committed here. And it doesn't rise to the level of a crime. It doesn't rise to that level. We're kind of in that transition period where just as a community, we have to start getting comfortable with just because we have a homeless person that's walking down the street that's dressed in a manner that we find a little peculiar doesn't mean that they're a threat to anyone. And so we've got to constantly remind ourselves that there's, that's a sliding scale. And
Okay, any other questions? Okay, not seeing any. Well, thank you again for being here. As a reminder, this item is on our agenda for Tuesday, January 27th meeting, AO 2026-10. So we will look for a debate on that item soon and a public hearing. Thank you. And we'll also reconvene here at 10:15 for a work session on the ASD special levy. Thank you.